everybody. My name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic. Yeah, I'm glad to see everyone here tonight. This is great. As a sponsorship workshop, if you haven't been with us before, please don't let the name put you off. This meeting is for everybody. If you're new, it will help you to find your way through the program. If you've been around for a while, it should give you some good refresher in what you've done, and also we hope will bring you some confidence and a feeling that you should be able to carry this message even better than you are now. And to do that, we study the big book and where we find everything, how it all ties together. And we are working in the Doctor's Opinion, and you'll find that in the front of the book. And if you have the 4th edition, it starts on page 27, XXVII. If you have the 3rd edition, it starts on XXVI. And we've examined a part of the Doctor's Opinion already, and we'll probably finish up with it tonight. This is an extremely important part of our big book. It is so important that it's very hard to overstress its place in the big book and what it does for us, and in terms not only of understanding the rest of the big book, but also understanding ourselves and understanding the people that we sponsor. Because the Doctor, in his opinion, did something which was totally unique, very, very brave thing that he did, because he went against all established medical opinion in 1939. He was willing to commit himself to the proposition that alcoholism was a disease, an illness. As far as I know, there wasn't any other reputable medical guy out there, or a psychiatrist or counselor, who was willing to do this. But Dr. Silkworth was willing. And the way this came about, of course, is something which is a major part of AA history. Dr. Silkworth had been director of Towns Hospital for some 20 years, and he'd had patients, 20,000 patients that had gone through his hospital. The hospital was devoted to rehabilitation of alcoholics and addicts. It was one of the few places in the country that had this specialty, and it was perhaps the best hospital in the country, maybe one of the best in the world, for the rehabilitation of alcoholics and addicts. However, they were quite successful with those who were heavy drinkers or who were just dabbing around with drugs. But when it came to the real alcoholic, the chronic like you and me, they had no success at all. And they knew in advance that they would have no success. In fact, Dr. Silkworth remarked that if he'd had a choice with Bill and some of the others, he would never have accepted them as patients. It was just too heartbreaking. And he knew that once a real alcoholic, a chronic, had reached a certain point, that there was nothing that medical science or psychiatry could do for him. And so, in his hospital, there were beds that were kind of set aside for these chronics that he knew he could not help. As a matter of fact, when we get into Bill's story, we're going to read that Bill, at his second visit to Towns Hospital, when he was leaving, Dr. Silkworth informed him and his wife, especially his wife, that there was nothing he could do for Bill, that he was going to die if he didn't stop drinking. Now, Dr. Silkworth contributed so tremendously to our literature and to the beginnings, not only the beginnings of the fellowship in 1935, but also to the continuation of the fellowship, because his opinion lays the groundwork for us to work with a newcomer. See, what he discovered was this, that the new person has to be told, they have to be hit over the head with this hammer, that they have a disease which is incurable and fatal and progressive, and that there is no hope for them from science or medicine, that the only hope of survival they have is total abstinence. And he found out that if they are faced with this, and if they believe it to be true, that this softens them up enough that they may very well then be willing to accept what we have to offer. One of the things which he told Bill after Bill had been out there 6 months trying to get anybody sober, and they was not able to do so. Silkworth told him, you're going to have to tell these people what's wrong with them. And of course that's carried over for us because we find that clearly stated in our 7th chapter where we are instructed how to work with a newcomer. When Dr. Silkworth was going through all of this 20 years, he came to certain conclusions. One of those conclusions was really so far out as far as the rest of the medical community was concerned that if it had been anybody but Silkworth, he'd have been laughed out of the society. His conclusion was that alcoholics had a disease, and he concluded that this disease manifested itself in 2 ways. One was that their bodies, alcoholics' bodies, do not respond to alcohol as normal people's bodies do. And he found, and he described it as being tantamount to an allergy, that we are allergic to alcohol when normal people are not. And one of the primary symptoms of this allergy is that once we have taken alcohol into our systems in any form at all, in any amount at all, it sets off a phenomenon of craving, he called it. And he described this craving as being far more powerful than our will to resist it. So that once having ingested any alcohol, we were almost always bound to have another drunk until we drank ourselves to a place where we could not go on. And so what he was saying is, you are powerless over alcohol once you have taken any of it into your system at all. And therefore, as we were reading last week, and let's go back to this because this is the crux of the first step. This is where it all hangs together. On page Roman 28 or Roman 26, whichever book you have, that's XXVIII in the 4th edition. Let's review this because this is so critical. We believe, the first full paragraph, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. That the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. And we think about that for just a second. Then becomes a very critical part of the definition of an alcoholic. A person who is not allergic, who does not react with this phenomenon of craving, is not, by Dr. Silkworth's definition, an alcoholic. May very well be a hard drinker, may very well abuse alcohol from time to time, but is not an alcoholic. And then he goes on to say that these allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. In other words, you see how that applies to the first step now. The first step, and let's take a look to make sure that we can meld these two things together. This is something you want to do with your sponsor. Take a look at page 30. That's 30 Arabic 30, chapter 3. Second full paragraph is the definition in the big book of the first step. Just 4 lines. we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. And then it goes on to say that the delusion that we are like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. That delusion is that we can, if we put our minds to it, safely drink alcohol again. Maybe we need a little rest. Maybe we satisfy the judge or the boss or the family, hang around AA for a while. But sooner or later we'll be able to go back out and drink like a lady, drink like a gentleman, and that'd be the end of it. This delusion that we're like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. So you can see that the first step really consists of this concession to our innermost selves that we're alcoholic, and acceptance with no reservations of the proposition of the truism that we can never safely drink alcohol in any form again the rest of our lives. And without that, with any reservations at all in that department, the first step has not worked. You can imagine what would be happening through the rest of the steps for anybody who was really just hanging in there, staying sober, playing the game, but believing all the time that sooner or later they'd be able to go out there and drink again, and drink with impunity. Well, Dr. Silkworth made this clear. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting, because when you read the rest of the big book, you'll find this is the only place in the big book where we are told flat out not to drink. Because nowhere else does it say don't drink. What it really says in 1,000 different ways is find God. Find a higher power. Have a spiritual awakening. Clear away the wreckage of your past. Join us. And so here Dr. Silkworth laid it all on the line. And this is so critical because it is so fundamental. And if we stop and think about it, guys, every time we're working with one of our sponsees and they're going to get jammed up, we need to be able to take them back to the basics here. Here's the basic fact. You're an alcoholic, which means you have a deadly, incurable, progressive illness. If you don't stop drinking, you die, but you can't stop drinking on your own. Therefore, you must get God between you and the booze. And the way you're going to do that is to work the steps and begin to live a spiritual way of life. That's the whole AA program in a nutshell. Everything that we do is centered on that one basic fact. In order for us to recover, it's going to be absolutely essential that we have God between us and the booze, because we're powerless. We can't stop drinking on our own. And to say to an alcoholic, just don't drink and go to meetings, is like saying to somebody else, don't breathe. Because we can't not drink. If we could not drink, we wouldn't need to be here. He goes on to say, once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Now let's go over on page 24, 29 I should say, XXIX or XXIII in the third edition, down to the bottom. I do not hold with those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. I've had many men who had, for example, worked a period of months on some problem or business deal which was settled on a certain date, favorable to them. They took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and then the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount to all other interests, so that the important appointment was not met. These men were not drinking to escape. They were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. Now that brings us in, doesn't it, to the other aspect of alcoholism, the mental aspect. And that becomes axiomatic, does it not, if we think, okay, we have this disease, and the physical part of it is if we drink, we're going to get drunk. So we can't drink. but we can't not drink. When our brain says drink, we say, yes, sir. And it doesn't make a particle of difference what the circumstances are. I know that many people in various other professions who try their best to help us would like us to believe that there's some kind of a set of triggers or something. Well, that's nonsense. We don't need any triggers. We're going to drink when our brain tells us to drink. We don't have to be down and out. We don't even have to be disturbed. We can be in a perfectly wonderful frame of mind. We don't have to be emotional. We don't even have to be worried about anything, or fearful, or in a jam. We already know that's true if we've read the book, because the story of Fred in chapter 3 is right on point, isn't it? Fred was a guy who had everything going for him. He didn't have a care in the world. The day he started drinking again, he had one of the most successful days of his life. Everybody was happy with him. Fred was happy with himself. But when his brain said it'd be nice to have a cocktail with dinner, he said, yes, sir. And that started another long siege of drinking, where he darn near killed himself. It was then that he knew, and he reports this later in that chapter, that he had hit one of those strange mental blank spots. That the results of drinking, which he knew to be edged with disaster, never even occurred to him. People are always saying, keep it green. Well, that's wonderful, but that isn't going to keep us sober. You can't, if you don't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it. Don't indulge in these fantasies. A lot of people were drunk in a blackout, they can't remember it anyway. That's not the point, is it? It doesn't matter how much we remember, it doesn't matter how little we remember, because fear of the consequences of drinking doesn't keep us sober. It is an actual fact, and it is an absolute fact, that we are powerless over alcohol, which means that when the obsession and compulsion to drink hits us, we have no power over it, and we will drink. That's the truth. And to suggest otherwise is to lead people down a blind alley. Our job as sponsors is clear cut. Our job as sponsors is to take the people who wish to, who care, who want what we have, through the steps. Because it is only through the steps that we can show them the road to recovery. We don't have any other method of recovery here. Meetings are not recovery. The fellowship alone is not recovery. Certainly making coffee or cleaning ashtrays is not recovery. Going to picnics or dances is not recovery. All those things are wonderful and part of our fellowship. We're not a glum lot. We do have fun. But ultimately, recovery is entirely dependent upon the willingness of your sponsee to work steps and your willingness to take them through the steps. Because it is only through the steps that we are able to achieve a spiritual awakening. And by virtue of a spiritual awakening, we are clothed in the armor of our higher power. That's the only protection we'll ever have. We're not going to get protection from other people, from fancy jobs, from lots of money. We're not going to get protection, certainly, from drugs or pills. We don't get protection from self-knowledge, that's for darn sure. Self-knowledge doesn't keep us sober. We learn everything there is to know about ourselves. We can learn all about our emotions and our feelings. We can learn all about the things that on the surface of it made us drink. We can learn what alcohol does to us. We can be scared to death of the results of drinking, and yet we'll drink again. That's what it means to be powerless. Dr. Silkwood goes on page 30, XX. down to the bottom of the page. And he's talked about the various types of alcoholics. Down to the bottom of the page. This immediately precipitates us into a seething cauldron of debate. Much has been written pro and con, but among physicians the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. Now, we have a lot of examples of that, but some of them are very well documented. For example, there's a man named Roland Hazard. I think we talked about Roland before. Roland was a very wealthy guy from a wealthy family, had a big position. He was, in every respect, he was a guy who had it made, but he was a drunk. And Roland had enough money, enough prestige, and enough pull that he was able to get Dr. Carl Jung to treat him for a whole year while he resided in Switzerland for that purpose. And Carl Jung tore his psyche apart, built him a whole new thing, and he taught him everything about himself. And Roland had all these enlightenments about his feelings, perhaps we'd call them today, or his issues. I'm not sure what an issue is, but whatever it is. And Roland had all this knowledge. And when he left Dr. Jung and came back to the United States, he was certain he would never drink again because he knew what alcohol would do to him. And he was afraid of the results of drinking. But most importantly, he had all this knowledge about himself. And in a couple of weeks, he was drunk again. And he went back over to Switzerland and he said, Dr. Jung, I don't know what happened here. How come I can't stay sober? And Carl Jung looked at him and he said, Roland, you're a chronic alcoholic. I was afraid of that. He said, there's nothing I can do for you. There's no way that science or medicine can help you. You're doomed. The only thing that is going to help you is to have a complete psychic change. This is going to have to be in the nature of a massive upheaval in your basic nature and the way you live your life. And you're going to have to be in close contact with a power which you identify as a power greater than yourself. And they said, I've been trying to help you to attain this psychic change, but I've not been successful. I can do nothing for you. Now, Roland Hazard came back to the United States and got up with the Oxford group. And through the 6 steps of the Oxford group, he was able to achieve sobriety. And because he was instrumental in getting Ebby loose from the clutches of the courts that were going to put him away for life, and Ebby was able to recover in the Oxford group. And then Ebby, Bill's friend, went to Bill. And that's where all this started. That's why we're here tonight. That's why there's an AA tonight. And it was through the spiritual awakening that these men were able to achieve by working the steps of the Oxford group that we're here tonight. Nothing else worked. Not religion, not science, not metaphysics, not herbs, hypnosis, or Pavlovian treatments. Nothing worked. Aversion therapy didn't work. Group therapy didn't work. How many hundreds of thousands of groups are there around now? And the tragic part about that is that you and I, when we come in the door, are spiritually bankrupt and crazy as hell. Our minds don't work right. And so the solution for us is to be found in sin. We are sin, and we are straightened out. And when those two things happen, we also straighten out mentally and physically. That happens to be true too. Let's go to the top of page 31. What is the solution? Aha! See, here's where all the nuts start to crack. Because you've faced the person, the alcoholic, with the bad news. You're an alcoholic. If you don't stop drinking, you'll die, but you can't stop drinking. But what's the solution? Why am I here? Why are you sober? Perhaps I can best answer this by relating one of my experiences. About 1 year prior to this experience, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had but partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. He had lost everything worthwhile in life and was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but there all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so he left me. A long time has passed with no return to alcohol. Now, notice that what was the solution? It's only 8 words. He accepted the plan outlined in this book. And that's what we have here. It's an incredible piece of work. Because since this book was written, millions of alcoholics have recovered by following the plan outlined in this book. Now, how in the world do we, in 2003, say that this book is irrelevant, or that it's been bypassed by all this modern stuff? New Age AA says that all the time. And look at the record. Now, one word has never been changed. It continues to be utilized by 12-step groups of every description all over the world now. This book's been translated into about 30 foreign languages. There are at least 170 countries where AA is in full swing. Millions of people now in recovery. Why in the world would we want anything else? Why in the world would we teach anything else to the people who have trusted us with their lives? I never can understand that. And so, Dr. Silkwood goes on page 31. When I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and deciding his situation hopeless had hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and in desperate condition brought to me. Following his physical rehabilitation, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment a waste of effort, unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted that even that would have any effect. However, he did become sold, on the ideas contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is as fine a specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. And now look at this last sentence. This is a sentence penned by and stood by and sponsored by a man who was at the very best an agnostic, who had relied all of his life on the rule of reason and the rule of science. He said, I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through. And though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. And the last word in Dr. Silkworth's opinion is pray. And that's because he saw what was happening in his very own hospital, right under his nose. He saw these men that he'd given up on, had consigned to the scrap heap of life. He watched them as they worked with the AA guys, and the last thing he would see them doing would be to pray, and then they would be gone. And a month later they'd be back helping the next guy in the next bed. And he saw this over and over and over again. Now then, we're going to start into the main part of the big book on page 1, chapter 1, Bill's story. Before we get into the text, let's think a little bit about what's in this chapter. This is an incredible chapter, by the way. It contains within it the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous, including, of course, the 12 steps. Most people don't know that, but they are there. Because Bill worked the steps while he was still in the hospital. And we're going to see that when we get up to page 13. If you have to look at it and read it carefully in order to see that that's what, in fact, he did. As a matter of fact, though, as we're going to read Bill's story, we're going to find him working the first and second steps and then going to the hospital for the third and final time. Thank you. And then, while in the hospital, his friend Evie came and helped him get through the rest of the steps. Wow, I got enough water here to float a battleship. At least my kidneys. We're going to watch him as he works the steps 3 through 11 in the hospital, and then we're going to watch as step 12 comes to him as a great inspiration, while he's still in the hospital, by the way. Now, of course, anybody who's read the history of AA knows that the 12 steps in their totality were not actually written down in a formal way until Bill was writing the big book, and that was 3.5 years later. Nevertheless, the sum total of his experiences in the hospital, as he recites them in this chapter, constitute the guts and the substance of the 12 steps. And so, in addition to that now, Bill's story is something which many newcomers walking in the door are going to be able to identify with, because he shows through his story the progression of the disease of alcoholism in his own life. He shows the effects of ego and power driving and pride. He shows the effects of dishonesty. He shows the effects of trying to run his own life. He shows how powerless he was, how powerless he became over alcohol. To point, he shows that all of his fears of the consequences of drinking did not keep him sober, and that he had been given many opportunities to learn everything there was to know about himself, and so self-knowledge did not keep him sober. And then we get to see the first 12-step call, as it's recited here in Bill's story, when his friend Evie came to his house and 12-stepped him. We get to see that first 12-step call. And then we get to see the beginnings of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the fellowship, where Bill went out from the hospital and began his odyssey of trying desperately to get anybody to follow in his footsteps, trying desperately to get anybody sober. And that how this all culminated then eventually in his liaison with Dr. Bob and 12-stepping Dr. Bob, and as they say, that's what it started all. Therein lies the tale. And so Bill's story is a story which has everything in it. It is a story which is an essential story for first stepping. As a matter of fact, which it needs to be said right now, because you guys are either sponsors now or you will be, the first step is found throughout the entire big book. There is no chapter, there's hardly any part of any chapter which does not contain first step material. As a result of that, the big book tells us that we are to get the newcomer to read the whole book. because the book was written for the new person in its entirety, not selected as your sponsor sees it portions or Reader's Digest expurgated versions, the whole book. And the reason that we know that to be true is because as we go through the book, we see that the new person who's one of his or her primary problems is denial. And this book is designed to break down those walls of denial. And it's also designed to bring hope. So that in reading the book and reading the stories in the back of the book, our newcomer is going to be able to identify himself or herself with the people in the book. Real people. This is not a bunch of philosophy. This is not a bunch of opinions. These are not essays. The 12 and 12 is a bunch of essays. This is a history. This book is a history. And it tells us how these people did it, precisely how they recovered. And so in reading the entire big book, over and over again, the newcomer has the opportunity to identify himself or herself with the real people in this book, which means that somewhere along the line, they're going to be able to say, I must be one too. Everything they say, I identify with. As they were, so am I. And then, because each person coming in the door is in a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, the hope comes. That's why the big book, remember when we were looking at the foreword of the first edition, uses the word seemingly to modify hopeless. He's seemingly hopeless, because it's not hopeless. Quite the contrary, there's huge hope, and it's found all the way through this book. And then Bill's story starts this process of bringing hope to the newcomer, because he shows just how hopeless he was and how he recovered. Now, also, this book, this chapter, gives us an excellent insight into what may be more or less the typical alcoholic, at least in the days when this was written. A man, power driver, fairly intelligent, a monster ego, a ton of pride, a lot of success in life, and able to make money, able to garner a lot of attention and acclaim, and in many ways be sort of a junior hero, at least getting his or her 15 minutes in the spotlight. And there's Bill, and he leads us all the way through this. Now he starts out not as a youngster. His story starts when he was 18 years old. It starts in the middle of the First World War. And the United States had just entered the war. And the French and Germans and English and others had been fighting with each other in the trenches for 2.5 years before that, dying by the millions in the most god-awful conditions. For whatever reason, the United States decided to get in that war. And this was the war to end all wars. This was going to do it. They were going to start a worldwide organization after this. They call it the League of Nations. And after that, the world would be at peace forever. They truly believed that. And the American Expeditionary Force, the Doughboys, were going over there to clean up that mess that the Europeans had started. And while they were in training and before they shipped out to go overseas, they were heroes. If you had been around and knew what was going on during the Second World War, you would have seen the same feeling. Soldiers and sailors and Marines were heroes. If you wanted to go from point A to point B and you're wearing a uniform, there'd be 10 people fighting to give you a ride. the soldiers and sailors and Marines were honored. And it was the same way for me when I was in Korea, when I came back from Korea. The stuff that started later, especially in Vietnam, there was none of that then. And so these guys who were enlisting, and Bill had some education, so he was made an officer. And they had the uniform, and the girls were swooning all over them, and they were invited into people's private homes while they were waiting training or awaiting embarkation or assignment. People in New England would have several soldiers staying in their homes. So let's see what Bill said about that time. By the way, at this point, Bill was a teetotaler. His family didn't drink, and he had been raised very strictly. So he was not a drinker. He was 17, 18 years old at this time. War fever ran high in the New England town to which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. And we were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime with intervals hilarious. I was a part of life at last. And in the midst of the excitement, I discovered liquor. I forgot the strong warnings and the prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time, we sailed for over there. Now that's in quotes and in capitals because there's a song by Irving Berlin that was popular at that time called Over There. Over there, over there. Oh, you're right, George M. Cohen. Yeah, well he sang it, right? Or did he compose that song too? I don't remember. Well, I guess he wasn't even around then, was he? Well, that was a good try anyway. There's always one around you know is going to correct you. You got to be careful what you say around AA rooms. Anyway, somebody composed that, and it was the theme song at that time. That's why Bill put it in here and capitalized it and put it in quotes. And then he sailed for over there, which meant he was on his way to England. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. Now he says much moved. Those two words cover a whole lot of what happened. And in other places he writes extensively about what happened while he was inside the cathedral. And he had what sounds like some kind of a very strong spiritual experience while he was in the cathedral. So much moved, he says, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Doggerel is verse, I guess you would say something like roses are red, violets are blue. I drink booze, why don't you? Something like that. That's doggerel. And so he calls this verse on this tombstone as doggerel. And he wrote it down as best he remembered it. Now it's kind of interesting. I have a photograph of that tombstone right here. Taken at night, so it's not real clear. But this is its third reincarnation. It's been replaced twice, and it's been replaced by the Grenadiers. That was his regiment, the guy who died, and they had maintained that tombstone. And if you go there in the summertime or late spring, early fall, there are lots of businesses and offices around there, and sometimes you'll see people eating their lunch around this tombstone and are even leaning against it. Now, in the book he says, this is the way he remembered it, here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. Well, now small beer is, as I take it, is kind of an ale, and being cold was pretty unusual over there. If you've been to England, you know that a lot of times you have a tough time getting cold beer. They like to drink it warm. But this guy got dead by drinking cold small beer. And a good soldier never forgot whether he dieth by musket or by pot. Now, that's not that wacky tobacco. It was a pot of ale. That's what you would go into the tavern and order a pot. And that would mean that you wanted some beer or lager ale or something. So it was served in what they called a pot. So whether he died by musket, getting shot, or drinking beer. So that was and Bill says, ominous warning, which I failed to heed. Now the actual inscription, Thomas Thetcher, a grenadier in the North Regiment of Hants Militia, who died of a violent fever contracted by drinking small beer when hot, the 12th of May. Now we see what happened. I was in Las Vegas one time. It was about 118 degrees in the summertime, and I watched a guy come out of one of the taverns there on South Las Vegas Boulevard on the Strip. He hit that heat and he collapsed and died. Age, it was 12th of May, 1764. He was 26 years old. In grateful remembrance of whose universal goodwill towards his comrades, this stone is placed here at their expense, as a small testimony of their regard and concern. Here sleeps in peace a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death by drinking cold small beer. Soldiers, be wise in his untimely fall, and when when very hot, drink strong or not at all. Now, so Bill forgot, he loved that though, whether he died by musket or by pot. When very hot, drink strong or not at all. Okay, now this tombstone, because of being in the big book, is probably the most famous tombstone in all history. How many millions upon millions of copies of this are out in 26, 28, 30 different foreign languages? Kind of an interesting thing. If you happen to be anywhere near Winchester Cathedral, that's a piece of our history. And so Bill says that when he read this, it was an ominous warning, meaning that he should have taken warning that alcohol kills, which I failed to heed. Now he comes back, 22 and a veteran of foreign wars. I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, for had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation? My talent for leadership, I imagined, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. Now that's where all this trouble started, isn't it? Bill and his ego, Bill and his power driving, and you know, the truth of the matter is, I don't think he ever lost it. A lot of it maybe, but his energy and the amount of time he devoted to the formation and the founding of this fellowship is just incredible. And we read the literature and watch what he did. Dr. Bob sat back there in Akron and worked with alcoholics. Bill went out and thumped the drum, and he was tireless. He was on a mission. And it almost undid him, you know, because in all of this he became so wrapped up in the fellowship. and his position in the fellowship, and his position as the grand guru, the co-founder, that when the Young Turks started coming along and started pushing him aside, he had nothing left. He was dependent upon his position in the fellowship. And that dependency damn near killed him. We know about this. As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting book, if you haven't had an opportunity to read it. It's called The Soul of Sponsorship. And it's not AA literature, but it contains the correspondence between Bill Wilson and Father Ed Dowling from 1940 through 1960. And during those 20 years, Father Ed was as close to having a sponsor as Bill got. And Father Ed was not a member of the fellowship. He was a Jesuit priest whose home and his work was in St. Louis. And Father Ed was very instrumental in getting AA started in St. Louis. He was tremendously interested in what we did. But Bill and Father Ed had a running correspondence. And during the time, for example, that Bill was writing the 12 and 12, it's very eye-opening to see the correspondence between him and Ed, and especially Bill's letters to Ed, where he was confessing in no uncertain terms just how sick he was. And in other places he writes about this. He talks about his Great Depression and suicidal impulses. They were very strong. During this period of time, it was right in the middle of when he was writing the 12 and 12. And we also find through the correspondence between Bill and Ed that Father Dowling was very instrumental in much of the language in the 12 and 12 about the steps. He wrote or edited a whole big chunks of that. Bill also at that time was trying to re-experience his epiphany, and we find him taking LSD. And then at one time he spent quite a long while trying to become a member of the Catholic Church. And eventually he was not successful in doing that because he wasn't willing to accept all of the dogma of the church. And so he'd been working with some high mucky muck in New York, way up in the New York bishopric. I don't know whether it was a bishop or Monsignor or the Archbishop or who it was, but somebody way up was working with him, and Bill finally had to give it up. He really wanted to become a Catholic, and you can see the influence of the Catholic Church in the 12 and 12, for example, where rather than talking about defects of character, he introduces us to 7 deadly sins, and introduces us to a prayer which many people now call the 11-step prayer, but which can never be a part of AA orthodoxy because it's a sectarian prayer, and it's a prayer attributed to a saint. It talks about an afterlife, and that prayer was just a part of Bill's legacy from the Catholic Church. So there's much going on here that's sort of beneath the surface, and it's very interesting to get into the literature, to get into the history of the fellowship and see what was actually happening back in those days. But Bill finally came to his senses. Now there's a beautiful story, a beautiful article that's reprinted in the language of the heart called Toward Emotional Sobriety, in which Bill shows us how he came to recognize that his dependency on the fellowship was what was killing him. And in that he sets forth what really is the rule, and this also, by the way, is repeated in As Bill Sees It. What he said was that every disturbance I have, great or small, at the root of it is some unhealthy dependency which I've allowed to develop, along with its attendant I wants, which are frustrated. And so he recognized that his dependency was the root of his very, very serious suicidal and depressions. and seeking for something that wasn't there. And all of this was because he wasn't willing to give up his position in the fellowship. When he finally decided to do that, it's amazing, because if you read the stuff that Bill wrote in the early 40s, and in the early, it's great stuff. You read the stuff he wrote in the late 40s and the early 50s, it's a different person. And then when we get into the late 50s and early 60s, there's old Bill back again. It's just incredible to follow the odyssey of his mind as it went through all of these things. And then as he recovered from this depression and began to write again in a most wonderful way. And there are articles in Language of the Heart that he wrote in the late 50s and early 60s, which are just knockouts. I mean, they're just dynamite stuff. So if you know the history, and then you can kind of follow this through, and you can see where it all came about. But it's a great lesson for us, and a great lesson we have to pass on to our sponsees. This business of dependency on other people, or upon institutions, or upon other things, is deadly for us. Now, I don't know how Bill could make it any more plain. He said, let's remember this, if I examine, he said, every disturbance I have, great or small, I'll find at the root of it some unhealthy dependency I've allowed to develop. I don't know whether you want to carry it to that extreme. Personally, I think he's right. And as sponsors, you need to be very highly aware of your responsibility to help your sponsees break loose from their dependencies, and especially that they not become dependent upon you. Now, one of the great faults of sponsorship these days is that there seems to be this tendency to develop a high degree of dependency in our sponsees, kind of like putting notches in our belts. I know people that I'm absolutely certain are staying sober on the ego of sponsorship. They don't have anything else going in their lives. And in the meantime, though, if I'm saying to you and you're my sponsee, you've got to place all your dependency on God, and on the other hand, I'm telling you, here's the way I'm going to run your life. Well, then it's got to be one way or the other, doesn't it? And so much of the stuff that we put out that seems to be based in some kind of a logic or reason, sounds good, sounds like it ought to be right, is just nothing but fostering dependency in our sponsees. You can't make any decisions. You got to call me every day or I'll fire you. You can't have any kind of a love relationship. And I'll tell you when you're going to work the steps. I'll tell you when you're ready. On and on and on and on. It gets to a point where if you need to go to the bathroom, you've got to call up and ask permission. Well, that kind of dependency is wonderful ego boost for the sponsor, and it's absolutely deadly for the sponsee. So let's all of us remember that when we're helping people, that we never help them by making them dependent upon us. Quite the contrary. And so we see here then where all of this got started for Bill. That he was dependent upon adulation, hero worship, leadership, calling the shots, being the big Maguna. All this stuff was so bloody important to him, and he didn't give that up when he got sober. Maybe for a while he did, but then all of a sudden he found himself as the leader of this band. And the further he went, he was offered an honorary doctor of laws from Yale. He was offered a major job with one of the big beer companies. They wanted him to do a lot of public relations stuff. He was courted by everybody in AA. Please, Bill, won't you come and speak? Please, Bill, won't you write the traditions? Please, Bill, won't you write the concepts? Won't you write a book about the 12 steps? Please write another article for the Grapevine. Please come and visit. Please come and visit. Sending money overseas. He was courted overseas. He traveled extensively. He was welcome in the most exalted halls of great power and influence and finance. He was courted by the media, the magazines, and they wanted to write his biography while he's still alive, all this stuff. And Bill loved it. And this isn't to say that he didn't earn this, but it is to say that it almost undid him. Because when it got to a point where the fellowship had outgrown Bill Wilson, and he was being pushed aside, it almost killed him. And so it's the second time in his life where this ego, power driving, and pride almost killed him. And here in his story in the big book, we're finding the first time that almost happened. Let's go on page 2 now. I took a night law course and obtained employment as investigator for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I'd proved to the world I was important. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or write. My drinking was not yet continuous. It disturbed my wife. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceived their best projects when drunk, that the most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. Can you imagine that pompousness? God. None of us have ever done that, of course. Nobody around here would think of pointing to Papa Hemingway, unless you happen to visit his house in Key West. By the time I'd completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that one day would turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. That was a lot of money. A lot of money then. I remember when my dad, and there were 5 of us in the family, my dad was making $100 a month. We lived okay. We went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined that they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. I developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. Hi everybody, my name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to see all of you here tonight. As David said, this is a hour and a half meeting, sponsorship workshop, and we have a friend back there, a lady who has not been with us before. And this workshop is the purpose of us being here is to learn how to be more effective, more competent sponsors, and also to review and to help our own spiritual growth and to learn. Some of us are new and we actually get to maybe take a look at the steps in the big book in a different way or for the first time even. So everyone is welcome. We're studying the big book right now, which is something we do in this workshop. We like to find out where everything is in the book. We like to find out how it all ties together. Big Book is an extraordinary document. My personal belief is it's an inspired document. I believe every direction in this book is meant for me to follow, and I believe that it tells the truth. I was taught that way, and I have continued to do that for a long time now, and it continues to work well for me and all the people I know. And I'm planning to continue to do that. I've been around here since 1964, and I've had great blessings. I've had more than half of my life sober. Tomorrow is my 75th birthday. Not AA, by the way, belly button. So, God has blessed me with good health and the opportunity to pass on what I know. I'd like for you to know that I really haven't had an original thought since I got here. Everything I know has been taught to me or I've learned through experience. Also, I found out when I got here, after I've been here for a while, that everything I knew when I got here was wrong. I had to start all over again. Unfortunately, the people who had taught me were lying to me, although they didn't realize it, because they told me that what I had to do to be happy and to be secure in life was I had to have an education, and I had to have a career, and I had to make lots of money. I had to learn how to deal with people and influence people and manipulate people, and I also had to acquire lots of things which would prove how successful I was, that this would make me happy. And of course, as we know, because we've been through hell, all that was balderdash. That isn't the road to happiness at all. What I found was that the more I acquired, the more I became afraid of losing what I had. And the more I wanted, and the more I became afraid I wasn't going to get what I wanted or what I needed, I found myself slipping into that abyss of fear and resentment, revolving around feelings of rejection and fears of failure. All of the religious training I had as a child became anathema to me. And I found, without knowing it, when I looked back, when I did my inventories, my fifth step, I realized what happened was that I had turned my back on God. I didn't deny the existence of God. I just didn't want to do with Him. And when I really looked at it, I realized because I was afraid of it. Afraid of being punished, and of course feeling a tremendous amount of guilt. And so when we talk together, what I share with you is what has been taught to me, or what I have learned through experience. You know, there's a very wonderful quote from a great philosopher. He said that when you hear about it, you're interested. When you see it, you believe it. When you experience it, you understand it. And I've taken that up and I've made it a part of my own feelings about what's going on here. That, for example, we always are talking about, and the steps talk about the God of our understanding. Well, I can tell you this, that the God of my understanding is the God I've experienced. And the only way I have any understanding of God at all is through that experience. And that experience came about because the steps taught me to take one leap of faith after another. And after a while, it became pretty obvious that God was working in my life, and I couldn't deny it. And it was then that faith began to grow. There's a part in our big book, you know, it's the 10th step, that tells us that we are to grow in understanding and effectiveness. It's easy to kind of slip by that, you know, and to just say, oh yeah, I know what those words mean. But do we? It seems pretty obvious to me that when it says we are to grow in understanding and effectiveness, it means that we're to grow in our understanding of God through our continued experiencing of God. Because this is leading us directly into the 11th step. where that's our job, is through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. And effectiveness, to me, means effectiveness in carrying the message, the 12th step. Carry this message to other alcoholics. It's the one sure way for us to grow spiritually and to stay sober. And so I see that phrase as having to do with actions that we take and experiences which we have because of the action we've taken. And when whatever I share with you, I hope, unless I label it as being opinion, I hope that it all comes out of what I've been taught and what I've experienced. So now we're going to go on page 2 in Bill's story, and let's think a minute about this guy, Bill, and his story. This is, you know, this chapter is incredible because it really lays out the whole program. It follows that general rule. Most of you have done some speaking or maybe some writing. What you're supposed to do is first you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So Bill's story really lays the groundwork for the whole program. It tells us what the book is going to tell us. And it does it in such a way that it is entirely personalized to Bill Wilson. Now, this is pretty unique stuff because we like to think of our big book as a textbook, and in many ways that's an accurate description. But a more accurate description is that it is a history. It is a history of real people who really did the things they wrote about. And they made that clear, remember, right there in the foreword of the first edition. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this volume. And they followed that all the way through. So when we read we, everybody wants to say it's a we program. Balderdash. The we in the big book has to do with the guys who wrote it. It says this is what we did. The steps are framed in we did this. First step has we, and the other, and we is implied all the way through in the other 11 steps. This is what we did. This is how we recovered. And we're giving you precise directions. We're showing you exactly what we did. And we wrote this book because we truly believe that if you will do exactly as we did, you too will recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And you will have a spiritual awakening. And you will have your heritage come true for you to be happy, joyous, and free. That's what they believed, and they were right. Millions of recoveries later, they were right. Why in the heck do we continue to fight with this book? Why do we continue to warp it, to twist it, to try to find ways around it, to try to discredit it? Why? I guess maybe that's just another illustration of our death wish, because the evidence is overwhelming that those who pick up this book and follow the directions in this book and work the steps recover. And if they continue to follow the directions and work the steps in every aspect of their lives, they stay recovered, period. Period. Now we find Bill, and Bill is describing himself as an egotist, a power driver, a seeker after acclaim and wealth and position, and boy do I know exactly what he's talking about because that was me. And when he came back from the First World War, he'd been a captain of the artillery over there, and he'd made quite a name for himself, and he was a leader of men, and he was going to just go right on up the ladder. He went to law school, and he just about flunked out a couple of courses because he was drinking all the time. In the process, he got to know a little bit about Wall Street, and he liked what he saw. Oh, not that stocks and bonds puts and calls and options and all that stuff was so fascinating. What fascinated Bill was all the money these guys were making. You got to remember now, this was the beginning of the big boom in the 20s. And there were millions being made all over the place. Everybody was riding that boom right on out. And of course, in 1929, it all burst. But Bill saw that and he loved it. And then when he got onto the street and he started working there, he was a really bright guy. And he saw what was happening, because in those days the information highway didn't exist. And people were investing in stocks of companies that they knew absolutely nothing about. And he said, you know, what we got to do is we got to find out what's really going on with these companies. And they all laughed at him. Why don't you just, you know, sit there and sell those shares and make your money and shut up. But Bill would have none of that, so he and Lois put aside a little nest egg, and they got in their motorcycle with a sidecar and stuffed it full of camping gear, and they set off. And his purpose was to go out and first-hand investigate companies that were trading on the New York Stock Exchange. And so at the bottom of page 2, we're going to see him doing this. Now you gotta have a picture of this. He's taken his poor wife and he stuck her in the back of the saddle of this motorcycle. She didn't get to ride in the sidecar because they had to pack it full of stuff. And they're going to be riding around for a year. You can imagine up in New England the kind of weather they were riding around in this motorcycle. Anyway, he writes this down at the bottom of page 2. We gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle. The sidecar stuffed with tent, blankets, a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of a financial reference service. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Now you guys have never heard of a lunacy commission. A lunacy commission was a legal body whose job it was to examine people who were brought before it as being crazy, goofy, nuts, crazy, and the idea was that if the lunacy commission decided that they were in fact lunatics, they were to be carted off and stuck away in an asylum somewhere. Now that's exactly what was happening to Bill's friend Ebby a little bit later down the road here. But he wiggled out of it because he had a friend at court. So they thought a lunacy commission should be appointed to examine him for insanity. And perhaps they were right. He says, I had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing our last small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. At the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. Now, there's a little bit more to the story. Bill would go into a factory town, and instead of going to the factory and insisting on checking out with the executives and seeing what was going on and reading their year-end reports and sitting down with their auditors, looking for dust in the corners. His M.O. was to go to the local tavern where the people who worked in the factory drank their beer, because they're going to know and be willing to talk a hell of a lot more about what's wrong with this place than any of the executives ever would. And he got all the dirt, and he found out everything was going on with these companies. He wrote it down, he sent it to his buddies in Wall Street, and these guys were making a killing there because Bill was firsthand identifying the companies that had a strong chance of being successful. So when he came back, he was a hero, just what he wanted to be. And he got the big position, and he started making money. And so he goes on to say, for the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. Ooh, he loved that. I had arrived.
And this was even better. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part of my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Remember, this was Prohibition. Everyone spending thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I had a host of fair weather friends. You might be interested to know, you AA Big Book trivia buffs, that be damned is the only swear word in the Big Book. You may look to your heart's content, and I do not think you'll find another one. I made a host of fair weather friends. Now here was Bill at the apex, at the zenith of everything he had wanted. And he was drinking as much as he cared to, and all of his buddies and friends and business associates were drinking too. I remember that. I remember how that was. I remember going into clients' offices before I got sober, and they would have the scotch out at 11 o'clock in the morning because they knew that old Jim loved to have his scotch in the morning. Also, I figured out later, much later, that I was probably the best free lawyer in Beverly Hills. Give me some booze and I'd say yes to anything. It was crazy. So Bill says, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real, oh, don't you like this? There had been no real infidelity. What the hell is real infidelity? As opposed to just infidelity? Bill, you slippery guy. There, shame on you, Bill. There had been no real infidelity. Maybe like Jimmy Carter sinning in his heart. No, I don't think so. That's not what he means here. For loyalty to my wife, oh, here comes the answer, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. Well, you just couldn't get it up, I guess, so. I'm sorry. I love this book, you know, and every word is kind of a little jewel to me, so I like to read it and see what it's really saying. Well, in any event, Bill's drinking kept him from being an adulterer, is what he's telling us. In 1929, I contracted golf fever. We went at once to the country, my wife to applaud, while I started out to overtake Walter Hagen. Walter Hagen was the big golf star of those days. Liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. I began to be jittery in the morning. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to carry him around the exclusive course which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. I acquired the impeccable coat of tan one sees upon the well-to-do. The local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. Oh man, Bill was riding high, wasn't he? Abruptly, in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock. 5 hours after the market closed, the ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ 32. It had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. That disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. That's a pretty good substitute for jumping out the window, I guess. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock, so what? Tomorrow was another day. As I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back. That booze was keeping him going. Next morning I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I'd better go to Canada. By the following spring we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. Everybody know what that means? Napoleon was exiled twice, wasn't he? The first time to Elba, and he came back in triumph. The second time to St. Helena, when he never came back. That was for good. But when he returned, he was right back on top again. And here was Bill. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena for me, but drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time, we stayed broke. We went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job, then lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Mercifully, no one could guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years, or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. I became an unwelcome hanger-on at brokerage places. Here we go now. Here, you see, this Bill's story is an absolutely marvelous exposition of the progression of the disease of alcoholism. If you got somebody who's new that you're working with, this chapter really gets them broken in a hurry, because they're reading a real story about a real guy, and here's what really happened to him, and they're going to be able to see themselves right here in Bill. Liquor ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3, got to be routine. Everybody know what bathtub gin is? That's that homemade stuff. See, it was prohibition. I don't know how much it was actually made in dirty bathtubs, but it was being made in people's basements. It was firewater. And you got to remember that like with vodka, the reason you have to pay a whole lot of money for fancy vodka is because it's been filtered about 40 times. And the reason they filter it is that the ethyl alcohol has hot spots in it. But bathtub gin wasn't filtered at all. And it didn't even have a very close way to gauge what proof it was. And that stuff was just like acid. 2 bottles of this stuff a day, sometimes 3. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s. Let's see what he did with it. I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. The heck with the rent. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by a half-dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. There's the disease, isn't it? This is exactly what it tells us in chapter 3. That the delusion that we are like other people or presently may be has to be smashed. And it tells us this, because this is, and Bill is just showing us in his story exactly what this means. The idea that somehow, someday he will control and enjoy his drinking, it's on page 30, is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. And here's Bill telling us that's exactly what was happening to him. I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Now, a lot of us have done that. We've gotten sober for a week or 2, or even, maybe a few days. Always pointing to the fact, well, you see, I can stop drinking any time I want. I don't have to do this, but I like it. It's part of my life. Now get off my back. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then, I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point in 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and the chance vanished. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Before then I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. Yeah, well, shortly afterward I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Now, this is quite reminiscent and a little bit ahead of time, but we're going to find exactly the same thing in chapter 3. And chapter 3 we have the stories of Fred and Jim. And here's part of Fred's story. Physically I felt fine, nor did I have any pressing problems or worries. My business came off well, I was pleased. It was the end of a perfect day, not a cloud on the horizon. I went to my hotel and leisurely dressed for dinner. As I crossed the threshold of the dining room, the thought came to mind that it would be nice to have a couple of cocktails with dinner. That was all, nothing more. I ordered a cocktail with my meal. Now, of course, Fred then went on a huge drunk. And over on page 42, here's what he said. They had said that though I did raise a defense, it would one day give way before some trivial reason for having a drink. Well, just that did happen, and more. For what I had learned of alcoholism did not occur to me at all. I knew from that moment that I had an alcoholic mind. I saw that willpower and self-knowledge would not help when now, this is his description, in those strange mental blank spots. I'd never been able to understand people who said that a problem had them hopelessly defeated. I knew then it was a crushing blow. Well, how in the world do you propose to fight against those strange mental blank spots? Somebody can tell you 3 times a day, every day of your sobriety, just don't drink and go to meetings. And you say, yeah, well, that's what, absolutely, I know what'll happen if I drink. That's right, you got to keep it green. Well, I will. Yeah, if you don't remember your last drunk, you haven't had it. And so, the big book addressed this, you know. We need to remember what it says. Let's take a look. Page 24. First full paragraph, about 1/8 of the way down the page. The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink. That's the rule. That's the real rule. And you see how dangerous it is to tell people that they stay sober by staying sober one day at a time. Just don't drink, no matter what happens. If your butt falls off, put it in a little red wagon, drag it to a meeting. All you have to do, just don't drink and go to meetings. Remember your last drunk and keep it green. Might just as well take somebody who is truly powerless over alcohol and push them in front of a bus. And sometimes these things get said so many times that we begin to believe they're true. Shortly afterward I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder. For such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near to being just that. Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills, ha ha ha. Now I had what it takes. Yes, sure. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it had happened. As the whiskey rose in my head, I told myself I would manage better next time. But I might as well get good and drunk then. And I did. And I know there are a bunch of people in this room right now who've done exactly that same thing. You see how this story of Bill's just takes that newcomer and just sucks them right in. They're reading this and they're saying, yeah, that's me. That's exactly what happened to me. This guy knows what he's talking about. But now I wonder, he wrote this book, or a big part of it, how did he get sober? Well, be a little patient. It's going to tell you. And when it does, you're going to then have hope. You'll go from being hopeless to having hope. Because you're going to be able to say to yourself, I was just like him. I went through all the same hell that he's talking about. And he got sober. Maybe I can too. First full paragraph on page 6 now. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My rising nerves were stilled at last. The morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Jen would fix that. So 2 bottles and oblivion. There's an old doggerel verse that's gone around the fellowship for years. Alcoholic died and went to heaven. St. Peter, he did tell. You'll have to let me in, Pete. I have already been to hell. The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse. By the way, that doesn't mean she had a thin purse. It means she didn't have much money in it. My wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. This whole business of running away from our booze, from our disease doesn't work. Take a look in chapter 7 just for a second, because this is really important stuff. Page 101. The first full paragraph. Talking about the things that happen to us in life and living our lives out there in the real world. We meet these conditions every day. An alcoholic who cannot meet them still has an alcoholic mind. There's something the matter with his spiritual status. His only chance for sobriety would be someplace like the Greenland ice cap, and even there an Eskimo might turn up with a bottle of scotch and ruin everything. Oh, Bill, there are no Eskimos in Greenland. Oh. There might be some, maybe a tourist. What do you think?
Vacation.
Yeah. Ask any woman who has sent her husband to distant places on the theory he would escape the alcohol problem. In our belief, any scheme of combating alcoholism which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation is doomed to failure. If the alcoholic tries to shield himself, he may succeed for a time, but he usually winds up with a bigger explosion than ever. We've tried these methods. These attempts to do the impossible have always failed. Oh, but haven't you heard? Man, you don't want to be tempted at all. You got to stay away from any place where there's drinking going on. After all, if you go into a haircut, into a barber shop, you're bound to get a haircut, right? It's all the same stuff, because you see, it doesn't address the issue. The issue goes back to what we've learned, right? It's already learned, or should have learned. That our problem is nothing to do with alcohol. Our problem has to do with our spiritual bankruptcy and the fact that we are powerless over the compulsions and the obsessions of our mind. And when the alcoholism has been defeated through our surrender to a higher power, that problem's gone. It doesn't exist for us. It's gone. We're restored to sanity. So the issue never is, what do I have to stay away from? The issue is, what do I have to move toward? And if we ever forget that, all we have to do is remember what we read at almost every meeting in the three pertinent ideas. That I'm alcoholic, can't manage my own life. Well, human power is going to relieve me of my alcoholism. But God can and will, if I seek Him. If I seek God, He will take from me the obsession and compulsion to drink. So the solution has nothing at all to do with staying away or running away or watching out for triggers or hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, or any other stuff. It has to do with whether or not we're earnestly seeking God. How simple can it be? And we constantly go around looking for all this human solution stuff and then relying upon it, and then we get drunk and we say, why? How come I got drunk? Mainly because we weren't carefully taught. So, we're back on page 6 now, please. There were flights from city to country and back as my one I sought escape. Then came the night. Physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window sash and all. Somehow, I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor, lest I suddenly leap. Doctor came with a heavy sedative. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. This combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity, so did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. Well, now, wait a second here. Bill is talking about a drug, isn't he? Yeah. Take a look at page 21, just for fun here. Kind of interesting because we hear so much about this these days. Down at the bottom of page 21. He is the fellow who goes to bed so intoxicated he ought to sleep the clock around, yet early next morning he searches madly for the bottle he misplaced the night before. If he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house to be certain no one gets his entire supply away from him to throw down the wastepipe. As matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves so he can go to work. Then comes the day when he simply cannot make it and gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine or some sedative with which to taper off. Then he begins to appear at hospitals and sanitariums. So there were drugs in Bill's story. And again in chapter 2 it acknowledges the fact that alcohol and drugs have been a joint story for probably forever. I think we have to be a little careful about how we look at people who have had trouble with both substances. On page 7 again, please. My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. And by the way, that was Towns Hospital, and they were also there for the mental and physical rehabilitation of addicts. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain was cleared. Belladonna is a poison. They were poisoning him. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Hydrotherapy is water therapy of some kind. First of all, I met a kind doctor, that was Dr. Silkworth, who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. Now, Dr. Silkworth was one of the few people that in those days, maybe the only one of national repute, who was of the opinion that alcoholics suffered from an illness. And so Bill heard that, and boy, that sounded good to him. It relieved me somewhat, he says, to learn that in alcoholics, the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. Ah, boy, my incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. You see, Bill had this lesson to learn, that self-knowledge does not keep us sober. We're going to learn a lot more about that in chapter 3. Self-knowledge does not keep us sober, nor does fear of the consequences of drinking keep us sober. So self-knowledge and fear, the two primary tools of human solutionists, are of no value whatsoever to an alcoholic. They don't keep us sober. Bill says, for 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. Things were real good. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. But it was not. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time I returned to the hospital. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium treatments, or I would develop a wet brain perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. Now that paragraph, by the way, is of extreme importance. And we'll see why. Let's get a little foretaste of how important that little paragraph is there. First of all, Bill realized, or later looked back and realized, that all the knowledge he had about himself was useless in the face of the alcoholic obsession and compulsion to drink, in the face of his powerlessness. Had he known what he knew later, he would have been able to figure that out at that time. As a matter of fact, this whole idea of self-knowledge plays a very important part in the early development of the Alcoholics Anonymous program. Because the man who saved Bill's friend Abby from being committed to an insane asylum for the alcoholics had been studying with Carl Jung, Dr. Jung, for a year. Had been completely renovated by that great doctor. He had every bit of knowledge about himself that could be crammed into his head in a year of working with Dr. Young in Switzerland. And when he came back to the United States, he was ready to go. He knew so much about himself. He knew what all of his triggers were. He knew what all of his emotions and feelings were. And he was entitled to his feelings, and he knew that he had to get it out. That if he didn't talk about things, they would kill him. He'd learn to talk. He'd learn to spill his guts to anybody who would listen. But of course he drank again. And he went back, and Dr. Young then had to tell him straight out, I can't help you. You're a chronic alcoholic, and there's not a thing in the world I can do to help you. The only thing that's going to help you is a complete psychic change. You're going to have some sort of moral reorganization, which I cannot give you. When this was Roland Hazard, when he came back to the United States, he hooked up with the Oxfordians. Within a week or two, he was on his way. And Roland's the guy who bailed Ebby out and taught Ebby through the Oxfordians how to get sober. And 2 months later, Ebby carried the message to Bill. Had he not done that, there's no doubt that Bill would not have survived. Self-knowledge does not keep us sober. I can tell you there is one positive aspect to what is taught and what is promulgated in the Human Solution institutions. That is, we do have the opportunity to learn a lot about ourselves. And if we carry that with us when we come into AA and we use it, for example, in our 4th step and in our 5th step. And if we take what we have found, recognizing that we have no power over this stuff, and give it to God, wow, that's when the miracle happens. We get to learn what did not work, and we got to stop doing that. And we got to start doing what will work. And when we do what will work, our whole life changes. And so Bill left the hospital, and Dr. Silkworth had laid down the law. He had taken out the sledgehammer and beat him over the head with it. You will die within a year if you don't stop drinking. Now, there was the real dilemma, because Bill could not stop drinking. He was powerless over alcohol, just exactly as you and me. When we take our first step, what do we have to admit? That we are powerless over alcohol. What does that mean? It means I can't stop drinking on my own. And somebody who comes to me and tells me, just don't drink, well, he's whistling Dixie. I might say, yeah, because that's what I really want to hear, because nobody has told me that I have no power to stop drinking on my own. Maybe I even try it. Maybe it even works for a little while. Now, there are some major exceptions to what I've just said, and those major exceptions come walking in the door every day. People who are described in the Big Book as those heavy drinkers who can stop or modify if they're given sufficient reason to do so. Why is that? Well, because they're not alcoholics. Now, we don't have any rules around here, and it's a good thing we don't. You remember when you say you are. If you had one drink when you were 4 years old, you hated it, and you never want to drink again, and you have a desire not to drink again. In fact, that's only inside you. Nobody can question you about it anyway. There are lots of folks around who don't need the Big Book and don't need the steps, and they can just stop, and they love the program. I mean, what the heck? Who wouldn't? This is a great place. You get love, unconditional love. You get all kinds of fellowship, something to do every day. You get to move on up. You get to be an AA politician. You might even go on up to New York as a delegate. And you never were an alcoholic to begin with. But that's okay, because we don't keep score. There are plenty of people around who are hopeless, helpless, chronic alcoholics. Plenty of us. And we do need the steps, and we do need God, and we do need the big book. And for us, that's what that's here. But there are many who do not have the physical compulsion to drink following the taking of the first drink. That's the definition of an alcoholic. And doctors, so we saw this when we looked at the doctor's opinion. A real alcoholic has this phenomenon of craving, this allergy to alcohol. Taking the first drink sets it off, and after that we're powerless. We can't stop drinking once we start. But when Dr. Silkworth laid the wood to him and told him how the cow ate the cabbage, it was to stick in Bill's mind. And when his friend Ebby came to him sober and been sober for 2 months, and Bill could tell that he was sincere and he knew that Ebby was a worse drunk than he was, he had to listen. And then when Ebby started to offer him a solution, Bill had to take that solution. And Dr. Silkworth was smart enough, canny enough, that he realized that that was a very big part of the reason that Bill was willing to do what it took to get sober. And later, after Bill had been sober 6 months and he had been unable to get anybody else sober, and he came back to see Silkworth, and Silkworth sat him down. He said, "Now look here, Bill. First you got to tell them how you drank and what happened to you when you drank. You've got to make sure they understand you know what the hell you're talking about. If they're still interested after that, then you have to tell them what's wrong with them." And he says, you got to get out the sledgehammer. You got to beat them over the head, but they got to understand that this is a fatal, incurable, progressive illness. And that they have, if they're real alcoholic, they've got this illness. And if they don't stop drinking, they're going to die. And there's no way they can stop drinking on their own. They got to understand this. So that's exactly what Bill told Dr. Bob on that day, that fateful day in Akron, when he had the chance, the first chance he'd had to use what Silkworth had told him. From there on out, this is the sledgehammer that we use, and we find it in chapter 7 in the big book. It tells us exactly how to use it. Make sure the newcomer understands what's wrong with them and just how serious that is. Down the bottom of page 7, they didn't need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. So now we see Bill beginning to be leveled here, don't we? We're really beginning to see Bill reaching a bottom here. I, he says, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. And there we see Bill in the first stages of his first step. Look on page 11. Second full paragraph. Go down to right to the middle of that paragraph. Judging from what I had seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible, and the brotherhood of man a grim jest. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal, and he certainly had me. And then his friend Ebby, in talking to him, down at the bottom of the page, 4 lines up in the bottom. Never mind the musty past, here sat a miracle. Directly across the kitchen table, he shouted great tidings. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly organized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. And that's the point where we find Bill has worked his first step. Okay. And we're going to see as we go through Bill's story that Bill works his first and second steps here before he went to the hospital for the third and last time. Now let's go on and let's see what's going on with him here. We're watching Bill's bottom as it develops. Second full paragraph on page 8. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. You see, fear has no power over that insanity. That's the problem there. If I'm going to teach you to stay sober through the fear of the consequences of drinking, I better find a way first to get rid of your insanity, hadn't I? That's the truth of it. The insidious insanity of that first drink, and on Armistice Day in 1934, I was off again. Now this is the first instance where Bill has mentioned insanity in the sense that we find it in the second step. Remember, the second step is kind of a shocker for new people, some of them, that God can restore us to sanity. And there's a wonderment here. What do you mean by insanity? I'm not insane, I just drink too much. Well, we've got several examples of insanity in chapter 3, Bill's Fred story and Jim's story and the jaywalker. And here Bill has pointed out right here in his story the insanity of that first drink. And on Armistice Day 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was to be the beginnings of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted in what I like to call a fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. And if you knew, read those 5 lines and memorize them, because that's what's really going to happen to you if you're willing to do the work. Just remember that we don't have any way of teaching you to recover around here except through the 12 steps. That's the only program of recovery we have, in spite of what other stuff you may hear. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. You guys all remember how alcohol works. First it's a sedative and you drop off, and then it becomes a what do you call it? Jazzes you up. Stimulant. About an hour after, begins to work as a stimulant. And give yourself 3 hours, maybe 4, sick, wide awake, ready for the next drink. Now we can see the time here because it was a very short time that Bill drank this time. Armistice Day in 1934 was on November 11th. That was the armistice of the First World War. I think it's now called Veterans Day or something. Or Armed Forces Day, I'm not sure. But anyway, toward the end of that same November, so it was only a couple of weeks that he'd been drinking again, but he was already in terrible shape. And so I would need it before daylight. He wanted that bottle under his bed. my musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it he'd been committed for alcoholic insanity. This was Ebby. And Bill had heard somewhere that he'd been hauled up before the court for commitment. He didn't know that Roland Hazard had stood up for him and gotten the judge to commit Ebby into his parole. And he took Ebby out of that courtroom and introduced him to the Oxford group. Unmindful, of course we would have dinner and then I could drink openly with him. He said, I wondered how he had escaped. We'd have dinner and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility, the very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. The door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. You might want to explain to your newcomers that though this is where everything started, Ebby was telling the truth, because in those days they were following the Oxford group, and the Oxford group was a religious movement. I've got religion. I was aghast, so that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot, now I suspect a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but God bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court, persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That's an important phrase, a practical program of action. Because you see, that describes the 12 steps. There's nothing esoteric or metaphysical about steps, my friends. They're very practical. They describe things that we must do. And then they tell us that if we do these things, we will achieve certain results, culminating in a spiritual awakening. These steps are great spiritual principles restated as steps of action. And when we do the work of the steps, we incorporate those principles into our lives. They become the way we live our lives. The 12 steps says to practice these principles in all of our affairs. That's exactly what we do. And so, when Ebby said it was a practical program of action, this is the first time that we've really been told what's coming. We're going to have 12 steps, a practical program of action, the results of which, believe it or not, are automatic. And I think it's got to be true that if they were not automatic, none of us would ever make it. If we had to think our way through or philosophize our way through all this, we'd never make it. The fact is, if we follow directions, the results are predetermined. That's why Dr. Bob was able to say in his story, it never failed, he said. If we go about with one half the zeal we used to be go about getting our next drink. And he was right about that. Ebby says to Bill, that was 2 months ago, and the result was evident. It worked. And what was Ebby doing there? He had come to pass his experience along to me, if I cared to have it. And here we go now. I was shocked but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, or I was what? I was hopeless. Now there's no doubt at this point, is there, that Bill has been granted the great gift of the first step.
Okay, we're going to cut it off right there. And then when we come back next week, we'll pick up Bill's story on page 10. I want to thank you so much for allowing me to share this with you. Hi everybody, my name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic. Glad to be here, and I'm glad to see all of you here. Anybody remember where we left off last week? Anybody got their book marked? I think we're in Bill's story, aren't we? There's a lady who has it marked, right? No, you don't? Anybody? Well, okay. I believe that we had reached the part of chapter 1 where we found Bill working his first and second steps. I think we talked about that last week, didn't we? And now we're going to watch Bill as he works the rest of the steps. So we're going to be taking a look at the big book starting on page 12 in Bill's story. If you haven't been with us before, this workshop is designed to go 35, maybe 38 weeks. And our first venture here is to go through the big book together, finding out where everything is and how it all ties together, so that we can be more knowledgeable in helping our sponsees in their journey through the big book. And when we have completed that, then we will go back and we will learn how to teach the steps, one step at a time. And this is from the standpoint of the sponsor, but it also works very well for anybody who's new, because as you can follow along with us, you're going to learn the big book and you're going to learn the steps. And in the process, of course, you will gain a lot of knowledge about how to work with others and how to teach the steps in the big book to them. And that, of course, is what we're here for. I remind you that Bill Wilson wrote in an article in the Grapevine that the primary purpose of an Alcoholics Anonymous group is the teaching and practice of the 12 steps. Now, I'd like for you to put aside any idea that being a teacher in AA is a dirty word. Quite the contrary, there aren't enough teachers. And what we're doing is, when we teach, is we are sharing what we have experienced. And of course, the big book is really one big teaching volume, because it teaches us what the founders did to recover. It's a history. It is not philosophy. It's not somebody's opinion. It's real life. This is what they did, and they recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Their whole thesis in writing the book was that if we were to do what they did, that we too would recover. And they were right, of course. So with that in mind, we have reached a point where we've been studying Bill's story and his odyssey through his alcoholism. And then we've gotten into the part of his story where Bill gets into recovery. Now remember that Bill was in Towns Hospital twice, and the second time when he was discharged, Dr. Silkworth told him and his wife Lois that he could do nothing for Bill, that Bill was doomed, that he would die if he didn't stop drinking. It probably had as much as maybe a year to live. And he also informed them that he could do nothing for Bill, that all of his scientific and psychological learning and all the techniques that they had were ineffective. They would not work for Bill. And this had been Dr. Silkworth's experience for almost 20 years prior to that time. There were people who came into his hospital that he had to give up on. He knew he couldn't help. And those helpless, hopeless alcoholics were kind of pushed off to the side. And that was important because later they became the prime source for candidates for AA as AA began to grow in New York. Bill was scared to death, of course, and the whole idea was that maybe he could be scared into sobriety. Well, all of us know that doesn't work. We don't stay sober on the fear of the consequences of drinking. If we did, all it'd be necessary to do would be scare us to death, and then we'd stop drinking. That doesn't work, never has worked, and yet it seems to be the basis of so much of the recovery philosophy that floats around today. And somehow we can teach people how deadly alcoholism is and teach them all about what it does to the body and the brain, and teach them all about their feelings, teach them all about themselves, and then give them all these clues about why they drink and the triggers and stuff. That doesn't work. Never has, never will. Self-knowledge doesn't keep us sober, and fear of the consequences of drinking doesn't keep us sober. If either one of those methods would work, there'd be no reason for AA, because AA is based upon an entirely different principle. The principle being that you and I are spiritually bankrupt and we're crazy as hell, and the only way that this is going to be ameliorated is through the intervention of a higher power. So everything in the big book goes directly to that one point, that God can and will if we seek Him. We just read that. You got to think what that third pertinent idea means. God can and will remove from us the obsession, compulsion to drink alcohol if we but seek Him. And how do we go about doing that? We work the steps. It is in the seeking of a higher power that we are relieved from the alcoholism, that is, that part of alcoholism which is the insanity, which is the obsession and compulsion to drink. We are not relieved ever in our entire lives from whatever it is that's wrong with us physically. That means that we are not like normal people, and we respond, our bodies respond to alcohol abnormally, and if we drink at all, it sets off an allergic reaction that Dr. Silkworth calls the phenomenon of craving, which is more powerful than we are. It's very important to remember what the first step means, what it says, and what we admit, that I am powerless over alcohol, which means precisely that I cannot stop drinking myself. And why in the world would anybody think that the solution would be to tell me not to drink? Nowhere in the big book does that ever said. Nowhere does it say don't drink. What it really says in so many words is find God. The solution is to put a loving God, a higher power, between us and booze. And that's what our 12 steps are designed to do. And of course it works. Millions of recoveries later, it works. So Bill is sitting there in his kitchen shortly after Armistice Day in November of 1934, sometime around toward the end of November 1934. He had been told that he was hopeless, helpless, he was going to die, kept him sober for a little while, and then he got drunk again. And he's sitting there in his kitchen, drunk, and his wife is out working to keep body and soul together financially. Shows up Ebby, his buddy Ebby. That's where all this started, the first 12-step call. And Ebby had been sober 2 months, and Ebby was doing what he'd been instructed to do, which was to carry the message, because that was one of the main tenets of the Oxford group scheme of recovery, carry the message. Ebby came to Bill. Bill believed Ebby. He believed what he said. He knew Ebby was as bad a drunk as he was. He therefore had credibility, and therefore Bill was willing to listen to him. And when he looked at Ebby, and he had to say to himself, would I have it? Of course I would. Bill had come to the conclusion, and he tells us in 3 different places in his story, that he was whipped, that alcohol was his master, that alcohol was the devil universal and really had him. So there wasn't any question after Ebby had broken through the ice that Bill came to recognize that he was powerless over alcohol. And also that it was clear, Dr. Silkworth made it abundantly clear to him that he could never safely drink alcohol again. Therefore, we saw in our last couple of meetings that Bill, in fact, worked his first step. But he had a serious problem. That serious problem was that he had been trained and taught from childhood to be quite distrustful of religion and religious people and preachers, that they didn't know what they were talking about. He had no doubt that there was some higher power in the universe, but he could not imagine that this higher power, call it God or whatever, would have anything to do with him personally. That was the problem. It was fine to say to him, well, you got to pray, and this is a loving God who cares about you, and Bill didn't believe it. And so something had to happen in order for Bill to move forward into his second step, because remember, the second step requires of us that we come to believe that yes, there is a power greater than ourselves, and that power is strong enough to restore us to sanity. In fact, in chapter 4, we find the precise test. And the test goes something like this. Faced with a self-imposed crisis, we could no longer evade or ignore. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or is not. What was our choice to be? Now we can see from that if we have by that time reached the conclusion and have come to believe that God is and that God is everything, then it becomes axiomatic that he is powerful enough to restore us to sanity. Not that he will, but that he can, that he has the power. And that's all the second step requires. But it's quite a leap, this segue from coming to understand the nature of a disease and admitting our powerlessness to a place of being able to honestly say, I believe that God is, and I believe that God has the power to restore me to sanity. And so what happened with Bill was that he was expressing these doubts, this feeling. It wasn't truly agnosticism or atheism by any means, but it was an honest doubt that there was such a thing as a God personal to him, who could care about him or would care about him, or that he could appeal to and expect to have any relief. Because he'd always been trained that you're on your own. Look to science, look to mathematics, they'll give you the answers to everything. The rule of reason was paramount in his day. So Ebby had to find a way to break through this, and we find that happening on page 12. The second full paragraph, little 3-liner. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? Well, now this busted through something for Bill, because Bill was a pretty stubborn guy. He was full of himself. He felt he was one very savvy guy, a superior person, and that his ideas he held dearly, and he wasn't about to change them.
And one of the things that he wasn't willing to accept was that somebody like Ebby or anybody else was going to tell him what he's supposed to believe in. I mean, there had to be some kind of a God here that these people that Ebby was representing believed in. And they were going to force him to admit or to come to believe in that same God, and he wasn't about to do that. But Ebby said, whoa, wait a second, Bill. That's not the way it is at all. Why don't you choose your own conception of God? And Bill says, that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. Read that for being stubbornly single-minded, not open-minded, full of himself, ready to fight the drop of a hat if anybody disagreed with him or tried to force him to admit to or to come to believe something that he had not already predetermined. Total prejudice. And Ebby pulled the plug on that. Now, this is something that we do as sponsors. This is a great line. It's a great remedy for the sponsee that you will get a lot of them, if you haven't already, who have the same doubt. How can I go past the idea of a czar of the heavens that controls everything and say that this all-powerful, all-knowing being is interested in me personally? It doesn't make any sense. There are billions of us on this earth, and there are probably several billion more worlds out there in that wide universe, and a whole bunch of them have beings on them. What is it that would make us think that it's rational to believe that this power would have anything to do with us personally? And so Ebby said, just choose your own conception of God. And Bill says, I stood in the sunlight at last. And then, this was okay, but there had to be more. Because at this stage then, Bill might want to choose his idea of a higher power, but maybe not. Because if he's still stubbornly hanging to his own conception, whatever it might be, and now Ebby says to him, it's only a matter, he says, of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required to make my beginning. And that statement is repeated 4 more times in our 4-step in chapter 2, Agnostics. That's the key. All it takes is the willingness to believe that there just might be a power out there greater than myself. And this, what happens here, I guess, I can't prove this, but it seems to me logical that once the willingness is in place, we open the door enough that God's grace comes in. Bill said that he learned he had to pray just as if there were a God, and then when all the miracles started happening and everything started changing in his life and he could no longer deny that these things came from a power greater than himself, he said that's when faith came, and that was the greatest gift of all. Now, we do know that even the most intransient sponsee, if you say to them, just as an experiment, try prayer. Pray to whom it may concern, or God if you dare, but pray. And just see what happens. Invariably, if they do that, things do happen. And almost always, within a very short time, the gift of belief is given to them. And so now we have found, as Bill says, thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want Him enough. Now that's a very, very powerful proviso, when we want Him enough. This is the burden on us, just as we just read in the third pertinent idea, that God can and will, if what? If we seek Him. You see, it all comes back to us. It's sort of like this: if it's to be, it's up to me. I've got to do the work. I've got to come to certain beliefs and certain conclusions and certain decisions. And if I do that, then, and if I truly want
God in my life. In fact, remember, some of you read chapter 7 where it's talking about this, that you can't force this stuff on anybody. If he is to seek God, the desire must come from within. And somehow or another, that comes to those of us who are chosen to be here. Many it never comes to. Just why, I don't know. But for those who achieve the desire to find God, then we can work with them because we can show them the way to do that. He says, at long last I saw, I felt, I believed, scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. See, he recognizes now in hindsight that what he was dealing with here was really pride and prejudice. He was closed-minded. Now, you in reading the big book, you can see over and over again Bill's emphasis on open-mindedness. In fact, we made a mantra out of that. It's part of how. Honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. Not altogether sure how all that stuff fits, but open-mindedness is clearly something which must come to us in order for us to begin to have a feeling that there is a power out there interested in us. I like to say to my sponsees, if you go down to the beach, you want to know if you as an individual have any importance in this universe, go down to the beach, pick up a grain of sand, carry it away from the beach, and it will be the same beach again. And you can put yourself in as minuscule a place as you want in this universe, but you are unique, you form a part of the universe, and you are important. We may be very tiny, but we are important. We have a place, and God cares about each and every one of us, and we find that out as we go along. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. You see, Bill is recognizing now what is happening to him as all of these changes began in his thinking, and he became willing to believe. And so what happened then, that he really wanted sobriety now. He was very sick. He had been, of course, he was heading up toward death. He was afraid of going back into seizures, delirium tremens, and he decided that he had to go back to the hospital and detox. And Dr. Silkworth was glad to take him back, by the way. He really liked Bill, and they became really great friends. And so at the top of page 13, at the hospital I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. And he knew what that was because he'd experienced them. If you haven't experienced those, I don't recommend it to anybody. That's bad stuff. I know I had 3 seizures and I was absolutely certain I was going to die. Now then, on page 13, this is one of the most important pages in the big book. And it's so easy, you know, for your sponsor, you just go right on by this. Oh, yeah, okay, well, sure, right. Without really thinking it through. What's going on here? We need to teach them. We need to know ourselves what's happening here. Okay, remember that by the time Bill got to the hospital, he had worked his first step and he had worked his second step. So now we find him back in the hospital for the 3rd time with Abby, his friend, there teaching him and bringing him what he had learned from the Oxford group about the steps to recovery. So let's see what happened. 2nd paragraph on page 13. At the hospital now. He's in his hospital bed. This is a short time. This is not a long stay. He wasn't there for months. Maybe a week and a half at most. There, he says, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him to do with me as he would. Well, that's the 3rd step, isn't it?
God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. So Bill's working the third step right here in the hospital. I place myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Remember, the third step tells us we do this without reservations. Here he says unreservedly under his care and direction, withholding nothing. Here I am, God, take me, use me, do with me as you will. The understanding being that if it's your will that I be in the outback of Australia next year running a cattle station with only Aborigines for neighbors, I'll be happy as a clam at high tide because you'll have me doing what you want me to do, and it'll be the right place for me. Whatever it is, I'm giving up. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. Remember our decision of the third step, how that comes about? On page 62 in the chapter 5, we find out that our problems of our own making, that alcoholics are extreme examples of self-will run riot, that we are the authors of our own misery, that God didn't do it. We find out that we have to be rid of this selfishness or it'll kill us. And then we come to recognize as we contemplate that third step that in fact we have been playing God, trying to. We have been self-directed and it didn't work. And then the big book says we had to quit playing God, it didn't work. And then the third step is right there and it just kind of sneaks up on us. The big book is so dense we have to read every word to know what it's really telling us. It says, next we decided in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. He was the principal. We were the agent. He was the father. We were the child. That's the decision of the third step. The prayer is a beautiful prayer, and it bolsters and effectuates that decision. But the decision is made right there when we recognize, as Bill just said here in his story, I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. Now then, when we have finished our third step, the big book then tells us that this is a vital and crucial step, but could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us, namely, defects of character, insanity, and guilt. And here in chapter 1, on page 13, I ruthlessly faced my sins. Read sins here for defects. And became willing to have my newfound friend take them away, root and branch. What steps do we see there? Well, obviously, we have the fourth step, facing our defects and our guilts. We have the fifth step where we face them orally and admit them to another person and to God. And we have the sixth and seventh step where we ask him to remove them. So he says, I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend take them away, root and branch. That's clearly, that last part of that sentence is clearly the sixth step, isn't it? I've not had a drink since. Now, the second paragraph here recounts that Ebby had come to see him, to meet with him, to teach him. My schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. Pure fifth step, isn't it? What are we seeing here? We're seeing Bill working all the steps, lying in the hospital in that week and a half while he was detoxing. Oh, but you can't do that. Balderdash. We made a list of people I'd hurt and toward whom I felt resentment. 8th step. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. 8th step. Now, interestingly enough, we find both of those sentences incorporated in our 4th step in our big book, because our 8th step is done in our 4th step. Maybe you may not remember that or haven't experienced it yet, but that's where we do our 8th step. While we're looking to see what others have done to us, we look to see what we've done to them. We find out whom we have harmed, and we become willing to set matters straight if we can. Our 8th step is done almost entirely in our 4th step. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them, which of course is a primary provision of doing the 9th step, isn't it? I was to right all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Pure 9th step. See what's happening here? It's kind of interesting, isn't it, when you take these 3 paragraphs, tear them apart, and see what's really going on. I hope that reading this may help some folks change their minds about when we work the steps, that there's some very serious misinformation out there, very serious. Really, the question is, how soon do you want to get well? And the idea that somehow our brains are too foggy to even contemplate the big book of the steps until we've been sober 5 years, things like that. I mean, this is deadly. Can you imagine how many people are being pushed in front of buses every day with that kind of nonsense? You know, the truth of the matter is, you look at the people who helped write the big book, you'll find that over half of them didn't have a year's sobriety. And many of that 100 were not 6 months sober. But they were already 12-step veterans by the time they were 6 months sober. When I came in I was going to say 1928, that was when I was born. In 1964, the rule was that you worked 9 steps in 90 days or less. I was working my 11th step on my 47th day, and I was slow. I think I told you that last summer I took a man through the steps in 6 days who was visiting here from England. He was willing to do the work, and we got it all done, and he's doing great. Okay, so now let's see what more Bill did. In the 3rd, 4th full paragraph on page 13, I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Now then, if you will turn to page 85 just for a second, we'll see where this comes in, this God consciousness. By the way, everything that Bill is writing about here is simply a foretaste of what we will be learning as we go through the rest of the book. On page 85, if you'll look at the last full paragraph at the bottom of the page, and this is at the time that we have begun to work the 10th step. If you look at the 4 lines from the bottom of that paragraph, to some extent, we have become God conscious. Before that, it tells us that we've begun to sense the flow of His Spirit into us, which, by the way, is what we're told in chapter 4, that we're going to find God deep down within us. It's only there that He can be found. And all these things happen, it tells us right here in this paragraph, if we have carefully followed directions. People like to hide behind this business of suggestions as if somehow that lets us off the hook. It means that there's nothing set
There's no, and they love to say there are no musts in this program. You know what that really means? It doesn't mean the big book, because that would be a blatant lie. You can find 62 or 63 musts and plenty of other phrases which mean the same thing, and all of them ultimately mean or else, must or else. That phrase comes not from the big book and does not refer to the steps at all. It refers to the traditions. And it comes from a writing that Bill contributed to the Grapevine in 1946, in which he said that there are no musts in AA, meaning that the traditions are all framed in the sense of we ought to or we should, not that we must. And so that's a totally false premise right from the get-go. So I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. I am conscious of the God within me. Probably, at least this is what I think, that God is spirit and I am spirit, and he is with me and I am with him. And I've had some very intense discussions with people who claim some sort of atheism or strict agnosticism, who talk about having found their better self. And I say to them, I think what you mean is the same thing we mean. You found something strong within you. We call it God, you call it a better self. And maybe that's true. It certainly gives room for some thought. So he goes on to say that common sense would thus become uncommon sense. Now, this presages, of course, what we're going to learn in the 4th chapter, where Bill takes great pains to help us segue from 2nd into the 3rd step by teaching us about the bridge of reason and how our dependency on reason will not get us to the new land of faith. That we have to go beyond that. And that means we have to begin to take some leaps of faith. That we're not going to make it simply by relying upon reason, upon science, upon mathematics, upon mechanics, or any of the other disciplines of the world. And it says, I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Well, that's clearly meditation, isn't it? That's what meditation is here in AA. We're listening to God. We ask and then we get quiet and listen. That's all it is. We don't need any of these directed, guided meditations. We don't need fancy music playing or anything like that. We don't need crystals or symbols or some guy in a saffron robe or or any of that. I mean, it's nice if that's what you like to do. If you can carry your ashram around in your back pocket, that would be pretty good. But the truth of the matter is that in AA, we meditate any time of the day or night. Whenever we get jammed up, we can stop and ask God for help, and then get quiet and listen to his answer. If I ask you a question and you're trying to give me a good answer to it, and I turn my back and walk away before you answer me, wouldn't you think I was nuts? That's what we do with God, you know. We pray and then we don't listen. I guess we got so used to praying in the before life for things that we were demanding that God do for us, that then we just decided we didn't have to listen for his answer. We just wait around until he answered our prayer. But we don't do it that way. We sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Now, in chapter 4, in the 4th step, for example, by the way, a meditation is mentioned 7 times in the body of the big book, not in the steps, but not in the stories, but first 164 pages. And it's always mentioned as something where you do it, don't you? Doesn't everybody meditate? It's never made a big deal, but it is one of the crucial elements of that simple kit of spiritual tools that the book talks about in the 2nd chapter. And so what we're doing here is we are fulfilling the 11th step, which tells us we're to seek to improve our conscious contact with God through prayer and meditation, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. See what Bill is saying here? I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as He would have me. So this is pure 11th step. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my requests bore on my usefulness to others. Again, pure 11th step. Then only might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure. So now what have we found? We found Bill working 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th steps and the 11th step. What happened to the 10th step? Well, the Oxford group didn't have anything that even approached the 10th step, and there was a good reason for that. See, they believed that once you had worked their 6 steps, that you achieved a sort of a spiritual perfection. And so therefore it was not necessary that after having done the first 5 steps, it was only necessary that you go out and carry the message. And you would have achieved this kind of a spiritual nirvana. And our guys found out that wasn't true. That isn't the way it worked with them. Tell you what they did find, though. They found that the world and all of its people would continue to threaten them. And they already knew by that time that threat equaled fear, and fear equaled the recurrence of defects and the recurrence of selfish, self-defeating, and dangerous and harmful actions toward others. And so what they found was that in fact they had to have a way to keep up with all this stuff. They had to know what was going on with them today. They had to know what their present circumstances were. Well, now how to go about doing that? Now, 10th step was not something anybody invented. It developed over a period of 3 years until the time that Bill sat down to write the big book. It had developed by trial and error, but it's all very, very logical. If I'm going to have a recurrence of my defects, if I'm going to have a recurrence of harming others, how am I going to deal with these on a daily basis? Well, I already have all the tools, don't I? I have the 4th step, the 5th step, 6th step, 7th step, 8th and 9th steps. So what am I going to do then? I'm going to take these tools that I've already learned how to use, I'm going to put them in one step, and I'm going to call it, as Bill did finally, the 10th step. This means then that as I go through the day, if dishonesty or selfishness or resentment or fear come up, those 4, only those 4, I am to inventory them, continue to take personal inventory, it tells us. I'm to inventory them, 4th step. I'm to admit them to another human being, the 5th step. I'm to ask God to remove them, the 7th step. And if I've hurt someone, I'm to make amends quickly, the 9th step. So now what we see, we look at it, we say, well, this was pretty smart. They took the tools they already know how to use, the 4th, 5th, 6th step, 7th step, the 9th step, put it all in one step. Said what we're going to do is as we go through the day, each day, we're going to stay current with what's happening to us, and we're going to use a spiritual remedy on the spot to stay free of these things which block me from God. Remember, that's what we're talking about here. That's why this stuff is so serious, because it blocks us from God. And if we're blocked from God, we have no protection, and we will drink again. Remember when we did our 4th step, what
The big book told us that these resentments were infinitely grave, that we had to be rid of them or they'd kill us. Why? Because they blocked us off from the sunlight of the Spirit. Now, so you can see what happened here. By trial and error and by experience, they found out that there's no way to take the steps and not have a recurrence of defects. Not that God didn't take them away, that's a foolish notion. But that they do come back because the world continues to threaten us. And it takes a long time sometimes for our faith to grow strong enough that we seldom have fear. But so long as we're experiencing fear, we're going to experience the recurrence of defects. And then they found that there was one more thing they had to do. They had to turn their thoughts resolutely to someone they could help. So that this 10th step not only incorporates 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, but it also bridges over to the 12th step. And then finally, to cap it all off, that love and tolerance of others was our code. That this was what we were to practice. See, that doesn't mean that we are to have the undisclosed, unarticulated, unacted upon love. Love, which is nothing but a state of mind, is nothing. It is just the same as faith without works is dead. Love without the action of love is dead. So this means that we are to actively love others, love them through our actions, and tolerance of others is not a state of mind, it's being actively tolerant. Tolerance without the action of tolerance is dead. It has no value, just a bunch of electrons floating around our heads. So you see what happened here. The 10th step was nowhere on the horizon at the time Bill was in the hospital working these steps. Now, of course, you say, well, there's one great big missing step here, isn't there? Where is step 12? Aha, good question, so we're going to find out. Bottom of page 13. My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. Now, a lot of people would like to argue about that, but this is at least big book authority for the fact that the 12 steps are the solution to all our problems. I found in my life in AA that to be literally so. And Bill makes no bones about it here, does he? Solve all my problems. Belief in the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. Let's see what that says again. Belief in the power of God, and of course that belief is a function of the second step, isn't it? Came to believe. Plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things. That doesn't mean a new order of society. It means a new order of things within us. A new way of thinking. A cleansing of our mental cesspool. A rebirth. And the rebirth means that that the spiritual malady is overcome and our thinking straightens out, thanks to God, to maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. Now, Bill is not saying that we have to acquire humility and honesty immediately, because the truth is that when we get to the 5th step, we'll find that it's in the 5th step that we learn enough honesty and humility as is necessary in our program of recovery, which of course means, and I know a bunch of people left the second night I was up here because I made a point point out that these so-called principles behind the steps are totally screwy. Honesty is something which comes to us as a result of the fifth step, not the first step. And humility is something that comes to us as a result of the fifth step, not the seventh step. And this is real clear. If you read the book, page 73, it's right there. So now Bill is telling us that these things must come. Willingness, honesty, humility. These are essential. Then he says, simple, but not easy. It is simple, you know. When you break this program down into its essential parts, it's very, very, very simple. Nothing esoteric about it. There's nothing about it that's metaphysical. It's all straight line. It's all straightforward. And the results are automatic. I promise you, if the results are not automatic, we'd never make it. If we had to think and philosophize our way through all this, we'd never make it. That means the promises that follow the ninth step are the inevitable result of working the steps. Work the steps, get the promises. You want the promises, work the steps. Simple as that. What do they say? They will always materialize if we work for them. Quite clear, isn't it? The restoration to sanity, the big book tells us this has happened automatically. We didn't struggle for it. It just happened. It came because we worked the steps. What's the 12th step tell us? We're not going to struggle for a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening comes to us because, why? Because we work the steps as the result of these steps. And that's the rule all the way through. Do the work, get the result. Do the work, get the result. Simple, but not easy. Matter of fact, I think some of you have been around here a long, long time, and you know what I'm talking about when I say that this is not a program for sissies. It takes some courage to successfully work the steps, especially that part where we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be honest with another person, and we have to make amends to people we perhaps have been running from for years. It can be a very fearsome prospect to a newcomer, and as a sponsor you got to recognize that and help them get past those fears. Simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. That doesn't say it would be, oh golly gee whiz, kind of nice if you sort of backed off a little bit and weren't quite so self-centered as you used to be. What do we don't understand about destruction? Got to be gone. Yes, sir.
Bill, I have a question back up
Sure.
a few minutes ago. You said about the principles behind the steps.
Yes.
And honesty being on page 73 and humility. Now, when I look at the first step and I say that we admit that we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives have become unmanageable, personally, I have to say that that takes a lot of sincerity and honesty. And if you're just fooling yourself with that, I can see honesty in step one. Now, granted, I see what the big book says about if you haven't learned enough honesty or humility, by the time you get to the fifth step, the chances are you'll go out and drink again. I see that.
Well, I think what it says is that we have not learned enough humility, honesty, or fearlessness as we find necessary until we've told someone else all our life story. Now, just turn that around. What it's really saying is, when you've told someone all your life story, you will have learned the honesty, humility, and fearlessness that is necessary. You just turn it backwards, and that's a clear meaning, isn't it? The other thing, you see, you and I might not be on all fours here. My view, what I've been taught about the first step, is that it is essentially a gift. And when we talk about honesty, we find honesty being something which is made a big point of in first paragraph, chapter 5, where it tells us that we can't recover if we don't have the capacity to be honest with ourselves. But honesty with ourselves and with others is something which really is tested in the fifth step, the fourth and fifth step. The question that you raised, it's a very good one because it's so seldom understood, that the first step is not taken until we have accepted as a fact that we can never safely drink alcohol again the rest of our lives. Because if we have any lingering doubt about that, or if we have the hope that somewhere, someday we'll be able to drink like other people, it really destroys the efficacy of the rest of the steps. And whether that connotes honesty, I guess in a sense it does, but I always thought of it as being an acceptance of this as a fact, and no longer fighting it. Now, I suppose too, when you're working, and I know you do a lot of sponsorship, so when you're working with somebody and you're asking them, have you accepted as a fact that you can never safely drink alcohol again the rest of your life? No reservations. At that point, I guess we have to either accept their statement, yes, as being true or not. And maybe, in many cases, it's not true. Maybe there's still that lingering reservation, but there's no way we can cut their head open and find out, or give them a lie detector test. So I try to make it as positive as I can, that this is a sine qua non of recovery. Without this, you don't make it. And so we will hope at that point for honesty, we will hope that the gift has been given, and that they have come to the absolute acceptance of this, not just as a theory, but as a fact for them, that this vain hope that they can drink again at some later date like normal people has to be smashed. So that's the way I look at it anyway. And I don't mean to, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but the principles behind the steps were propounded by those three guys in Texas and published in the Grapevine. It's not part of AA literature. It's not approved AA literature, and it sets up false standards, because most of that stuff is not a principle at all. It's a way of being. Or maybe a wonderful way to live your life, or something we ought to be. But the principles are the steps. And I don't see how you can have a principle behind a principle. I don't think that's logically possible. So that's why I make a point of it sometimes. And I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence by that, but I'm glad you asked the question, because I'm happy to have a chance to explain what my point of view is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, it answers my question.
Good. Well, listen, thanks a lot for bringing that up.
Jim, I got a question.
Yes, Tom.
When the big book was written, wasn't it an honest desire to stay sober was the only requirement? What is the difference between that honesty and?
Well, I don't know. That was taken out when the traditions were written. That was in the foreword of the first edition, an honest desire to stop drinking. And I often wondered, what would be a dishonest desire? How can you have a desire which is dishonest? It's either a desire or it isn't. So that's why when Bill got around to writing the traditions, he realized that word was pure surplusage. It had no real meaning. So it was taken out. It's not in the traditions. You find it only in the foreword of the first edition.
I admitted I was pilot sober alcohol, and I was unmanageable twice, and I drank after that. So was I not honest, or was I just? Well, my idea of
that's one step out of 12. That's where it all starts. Without that, the steps are not going to work for you. So, but once you work the 12 steps and you continue to stay on a spiritual path through 10, 11, and 12, I've never seen anybody who does that who went back out. Dr. Bob agrees with that. Remember, he told us in his story, it never fails, but you got to go about it with one half as you used to go about getting the next drink, which means the big book says we have to be disciplined about discipline and consistent. It tells us that we do this every single day. Now, and I know for a fact in my own experience and the people I've worked with, and I know a lot of folks, people who do that don't drink. And inevitably, if somebody's been around for a while and they start drinking,
the first question you want to ask them when they come back, did you stop working your 11th step? And inevitably they'll say yes. And Bill wrote a whole article about that one time in the Grapevine. It ended up in Language of the Heart, where he talks about take the 11th step, and he says that this is what happens. We know something's wrong. We're hiding it. We're presenting a bright face to the group and to the world. Our bright-eyed friends, he say, tell us how well we're doing, and he says, but inside we know better. We're not doing well at all. And so the reason here is because we have stopped working our 11th step. Through prayer and meditation and inventory, we continue to grow spiritually. And it's so important to understand how all this stuff works together. For example, there's one sentence in the third step on page 63, which is really the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous in one sentence. It says that God, being all-powerful, will provide what we need, everything we need, if we stay close to Him and perform His work well. And that, of course, includes the sobriety that we need, plus everything else we need. The joker in that deck is that we've got to do whatever is necessary to stay close to God and to perform His work well. And once having reached the point of the ninth step and having been restored to sanity from there on, staying close to God is a function of the 10th, 11th, and 12th steps. And the 11th step is a step where every night we check to see if we've gotten off the path. And we go through 10 questions, and we ask ourselves those 10 questions every night to look back. If we've gotten off the path, we ask God for help, we ask His forgiveness, we ask Him to show us how to do better. And then we pray and we meditate in that step as well. And these are highly, highly spiritual actions we take, which will keep us growing spiritually. And that's the key, because, you know, a lot of you have been around a long time. You know you cannot stand still spiritually. You cannot. We must either go forward or we'll go back. And our steps give us all the tools we need to continue to grow spiritually. So if you're new, make up your mind that you're in this for the duration. And that means that you're going to be learning how not only to get sober, but how to stay sober and to grow spiritually. And it's going to be necessary for you to dedicate a certain part of each day in your life from now on to doing your spiritual work, because that's the only thing that will work.
Thanks, Jim.
Anyway, that's a long answer. I'm not even sure what the question was now, but you see, I'm one of these guys that have been doing this so long. You wind me up, and I just start going. It's like that rabbit, you know, that runs around with the batteries. I just keep going. Okay. So, this is one of the most important statements in the whole big book. And it is a statement which is followed to the nth degree. See, the big book is absolutely consistent internally. It's never inconsistent. And here's something which a sponsor has to know. Top of page 14, the second sentence in the first paragraph. I must turn in all things to the Father of light, who presides over us all. That means all things. What don't we understand about the word all? That means that when we presume as sponsors to begin to direct our sponsees' lives from our own predilections, prejudices, and maybe some of the stuff we've learned, we get clear off base, because we begin to violate this major provision that we teach our sponsees to turn in all things to the Father of light. And when we begin to tell them that they can do this or they can't do that, and setting time limits on this and time limits on that, directing their lives, especially their relationship lives, we run directly afoul of this very simple provision. We teach them instead to turn to God. Just as the big book tells us in the 4th step, when we have any sexual problems, the remedy is simple. It tells us in our morning meditation, we ask God what we should do about each specific matter, and that the right answer will come if we want it.